Now, this week's microlecture is sort of a response to a student request. I asked what people would like to see as a podcast, and someone suggested dialectic, which I think is a pretty good suggestion. It's a very difficult, quite technical philosophical term, but it does get thrown around an awful lot. So what actually is dialectic? That's what I'm going to be trying to answer today in the next 10 to 15 minutes. I think the best place to start is to say dialectic is all about contradiction. When it pops up right at the beginning of Western philosophy with this fellow Plato, it's deeply related to something called the Socratic method, which is a method of inquiry, or a method of teaching in fact, which is all about contradiction. The idea is the teacher here, Socrates, comes along and he doesn't impose predetermined accounts or concepts on his students or his interlocutors. Rather, he prompts them to give an account of what the concept is, what they think to be the truth. And then Socrates comes in and points out problems and contradictions. And by working through these contradictions, one comes out with a better idea of the truth. So, for example, a good example of this would be the second dialogue in this book, Euthyphro, which is all about the concept of holiness. Socrates comes and prompts Euthyphro to give an account of what holiness is. And Euthyphro says, well, what is holy is what the gods love. That's what holiness is. And Socrates points out there's a slight problem with this definition, because the question can be asked, well, on what basis are the gods loving whatever is holy, for example, an act of sacrifice? And so Socrates says, well, hang on, Euthyphro, when you are asked what the holy might be, it looks as if you'd prefer not to explain its essence to me, but would rather tell me one of its properties, namely that the holy has the property of being loved by all the gods, but you still haven't told me what it is. And Euthyphro finds himself being caught in this dialectical problem. The trouble is, Socrates, that I can't tell you what I have in mind, because whatever we suggest keeps moving around somehow and refuses to stay put where we established it. Now, the details of this argument about holiness, although they're very interesting, aren't really relevant. What I want to point out is that it's a method of trying to establish the truth by taking one theory and pointing out contradictions in it and saying, well, in that sense, that theory must be false, and we must move on and try and find a new definition or a deeper definition of holiness. So dialectic is all about the finding of contradictions in people's accounts and people's concepts. Now, this more or less holds sway throughout the history of philosophy. For example, when we come to the end of the 18th century and Immanuel Kant, he is using the word dialectic, the term dialectic, in a not altogether foreign way, a way certainly that Plato would kind of understand it. So, for example, in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is his greatest work of metaphysics, the dialectic comes down to things like this. Look at this page here, I hope you can see that. What we actually have here is what Kant calls an antinomy of pure reason. Again, the details aren't really important, but what he's trying to argue is that there are two theories here. This particular page is about whether the world has a beginning in time, or whether the world has no beginning in time, whether the universe is infinite or finite in essence. And what Kant argues is there are equally satisfying proofs for both sides of the argument. We can argue very effectively that the world does have a beginning, and we can argue equally effectively that the world has no beginning. And so we have, of course, a contradiction, and hence a dialectical kind of thing. Now, what Kant does with this is, just for your own interest, is to argue that we have reached a question that is beyond our powers. We cannot extend our powers of reason and rationality to answer questions like, does the universe have a beginning in time, or does it not? Is the universe infinite or finite? Because those are metaphysical questions. And when we try and push our faculties to those kind of questions beyond their scope, then we run into contradictions. And therefore, this is Kant's whole philosophical project, is about trying to demarcate the questions that we can answer and the ones that are too metaphysical, that are beyond the way that our minds are constructed and the way that our concepts are constructed. Again, details, not very important, but what is important is that Kant's use of the term dialectic, and that part of the book is called the transcendental dialectic, it's all to do with finding contradictions. In this particular case, as I say, the idea that we can have two arguments arguing totally different things that seem equally valid, and yet, as I say, they can't both be true, because the universe can't not have a beginning and have a beginning. So, dialectic, contradiction, it's all about the finding of contradictions in arguments and concepts. That would seem to be fairly settled then. However, in the wake of Kant, we have probably the next most famous German philosopher, and he is Hegel. Now, he takes up dialectic and does something very interesting, very new, very radical with it. And that is to say, yes, it's all about contradiction, but that's not the end of the story. When Plato had found a contradiction, then that was an indication of falsity. We can't possibly have an argument that is internally contradictory, it must be false. Again, when Kant found a contradiction, we reached another kind of limit, falsity. If this question can have two equally satisfying arguments for different answers, then we must have reached the limit of our faculties. Now, Hegel doesn't believe that contradiction is a kind of roadblock in the same way that Plato or Kant might do, and that's because he believes concepts are contradictory. He suggests that all concepts contain a kind of seed of their opposites, in the sense that night contains the seed of day, or that left contains the seed of right. So all concepts are kind of internally tense, or almost self-contradictory. Contradiction is very important to Hegel. He says identity, or the lack of contradiction, is merely the determination of the simple immediate of dead being. But contradiction, and here's the important part, contradiction is the root of all movement and vitality. And in Hegel's work, concepts don't stay still. They are contradictory. They are continually passing over into other concepts, and indeed into their opposites. And here we find or run across a very famous schema, which is Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And that really is the model of his dialectic. The idea is that we have a thesis, a concept, and then within it there's a kind of opposite concept. And then we can move forward and we can synthesize those two concepts, the first one and its opposite, together, and that becomes the new thesis. But then this rolls over, so the new thesis has another opposite, and we have another pattern of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The synthesis becomes the new thesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So we have a movement of concepts, a passing over, a working out, and it's all based on contradiction. Theses passing into their antitheses and creating new syntheses. Now that might seem horribly abstract, so I'm going to try and give you a brief example from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Now, Hegel, in this particular section of this work, is interested in the way that the self, the I, confronts the world. Now, and the question of desire in particular. Now, Hegel suggests the first stage, if you will, the thesis, is that the self tries to sort of satiate its desire in an object, could be food or whatever, a book, could be anything. But the problem is that objects are consumed. So, for example, you read the book and it is gone, and suddenly you are back where you started from, or you eat the food, it is destroyed. And so the self's desire can never be satisfied by mere objects, because when you sort of possess them, they're destroyed. And therefore we have a movement to a different stage. And this is where the self tries to satisfy its desire in another person rather than a mere object. However, there's a problem. Again, we have this rolling over, because the other person is going to be trying to do the same to you, trying to satisfy their desire by possessing you as you try to possess them. And what Hegel describes is a life and death struggle, which ends with one or the other of the people becoming the master and the other becoming the slave. And this is the next stage. We've moved on from a self trying to satisfy itself in an object, such as food or whatever, to a self trying to satisfy itself by dominating another person. And we have the master lording it over the slave. So there is a thesis, antithesis, synthesis movement going on here, all to do with the self and its desire. However, because things always contain their opposites, even the mastery over the slave is not stable. Things are not cut and dried, things are not finished here. There is still a contradiction to be worked out. What Hegel points out is that as the slave goes to work for the master, it becomes apparent that the master's security, the master's power, is now dependent, of course, on the slave and the slave working. And therefore, the master is only a master because the slave is around, and thus there is a kind of dependence. This is a very famous little logical dialectic, which is known as the master-slave dialectic. So the master, although he thinks he has sovereignty, that he is secure, that he has satisfied his desire, now finds in fact he is dependent on the slave, because it's only because the slave is there that he is the master. One cannot have mastery if there is no slaves. They are mutually defining. So what we've had is this movement from a self trying to satisfy itself in an object to trying to satisfy itself in a person and creating a mastery-slavery relationship. But then this other stage where we discover that mastery is not quite so secure because it depends on having a slave there. So the slave has a kind of power over the master, as strange and as contradictory as that may at first seem. But of course that's Hegel. Contradiction is for him the root of all movement and vitality. Contradiction is absolutely essential to everything he does. So what does this tell us? Why is this important? Well, Hegel's great kind of innovation and revision of the dialectic is to argue that things can only be captured as a process. For example, this process I just sketched out with the object, the person, the life-death struggle, the establishment of mastery and slavery, and then that other stage where the master realizes he is troublingly dependent on the slave. Being can only be captured as a process. It's always moving. Whether that process is on the small scale, a life, an individual consciousness, or actually as Hegel's work kind of goes out and looks at bigger issues, it could be the movement of society or indeed the whole movement of human history. And that's all to do with contradiction, because he says that things are always moving because of contradictions. And no particular situation in time is stable. It's always moving, and its contradiction will kind of push it on to a different phase. And all of Hegel's philosophy is really dedicated to following through the working throughs of contradictions and following this movement of being. Being can only be captured philosophically as a process, as something that is being generated and dissolved through this movement of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So far from being a problem, as it was in Plato, for example, contradiction is the sign of an argument being false or a concept being inadequate. For Hegel, contradiction is the very engine of life itself, of history itself. There's one further little twist that's very important, and that is Marx, who was very much trained as a Hegelian, but he revises the dialectic in a particular way. He too believes that being can only be captured as a process. He believes that any particular situation at one moment in time has a kind of internal tension, an internal contradiction, which will force it to generate into something else. But what he does is he says that Hegel has things the wrong way round. Hegel is all about concepts passing into their opposites, and he suggests that history is driven, therefore, by the contradictions in concepts, in ideas, in what Hegel calls the spirit. Marx says, no, Hegel is too idealist. He thinks too much of the concept, of the idea. History for Marx is driven not by ideas, but by real things, by material things. And that's why Marx is often said to give a materialist revision, or indeed a materialist inversion of Hegel. He has exactly the same kind of idea of being as a process driven by contradiction. Indeed, we can see that same thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure driving history for Marx, driving any process. However, whereas the theses and the antitheses were ideas in Hegel, in Marx they are material things. They are forms of existence, and in particular they are classes. And when Marx works out his theory of history, it is dialectical, it is about contradiction, but the terms of that contradiction, the theses, the antithesis, they tend to be things like social classes. So for example, very famously, the bourgeoisie create their own antithesis, which is the proletariat, and therefore there is a contradiction, a class struggle between the middle classes and the working classes, and Marx foresees that there will ultimately be a synthesis, which will be attained through class struggle and ultimately revolution. And so he sees history proceeding on the basis of conflict, class conflict. And behind that class conflict is that old idea of Hegelian contradiction, of dialectical contradiction. And so that's kind of what Marx does to Hegel. He materialises it. He brings it back to things, to matter, and ultimately to social forms of existence and social classes. But the same principle is there. It's about contradictions driving a kind of restless history. So that's what dialectic is about. It's about contradiction, and it has been for the history of philosophy. But in the 19th century, with Hegel and with Marx, contradiction has a very different kind of edge. Contradiction is no longer a roadblock, it's actually right at the centre of things. We see being as contradictory, as being driven by contradictions. And I think that's the big legacy of Hegel and also Marx for 20th century philosophy and for contemporary thought. Firstly, it's for showing that contradiction is not just a roadblock. Contradiction is kind of inherent in concepts and states of affairs, and that there's always a kind of internal tension which is bursting and which may work itself out, and that concepts will pass over into their opposites, that situations will pass over into new situations driven by their internal contradictions. Concepts are not identities, as Hegel would put it, they are subsumed contradictions. The other great thing I think that Hegel does is this idea of being only being captured as a process by being restless because of its internal contradictions. And this shows that being has to be embedded in time, it has to be embedded in history. There's a brilliant little sentence near the end of Hegel's work. No one can escape from the substance of his own time any more than he can jump out of his skin. Looked at fundamentally, no philosophy can overleap its own time. This idea of us, of beings, of philosophies, of everything being kind of embedded in a flow of time, in a restlessness of time. I think this is really interesting. When you put these two great legacies together, firstly the idea that contradiction is not necessarily a bad thing, but maybe intrinsic to the very idea of a concept, that concepts are always internally contradictory or contain the seeds of their opposites, the seeds of their own negations. And this idea that being must be conceived of as a process rather than just something standing stock still, that thought and being and existence is all embedded in time. If you put those together, you can get quite a powerful analysis. So I'll just end with one that I find particularly interesting, and one I was discussing only very recently when I was thinking about the category of romanticism with a friend who's a PhD in romantic literature. I think literary history is dialectical. When we try and look at a particular state of affairs within the flow of time, such as the Romantic period, we can get ourselves into all kinds of knotty problems because we try and make Romanticism stand still. We want to extract some kind of static definition which is applicable to every poem published in the Romantic period. And we could do the same for the Renaissance or modernism or postmodernism or even the contemporary, whatever it is. We try and freeze frame history or a literary period in history and define it. That's very undialectical, it's very un-Hegelian. What I think is a much better approach is to try dialectics and to say that actually the freeze frame that we take, be that Romanticism, be that modernism, be that whatever, will be internally contradictory. Why is that? Because Romanticism is merely a phase in a restless flow of time. When we look at something like the Romantic period, what we see are the after effects of earlier periods, and we also see the seeds of later periods. Romanticism, if you will, is both at the same time the prehistory of later literature, but it is also the after history, the aftershocks of earlier periods of literature. And of course this keeps on going. If we say that Romanticism is a kind of prehistory for Victorian literature, we go to Victorianism, and not only must we therefore say that Victorianism is the aftershock of Romanticism, but that Victorianism is in turn a kind of prehistory of modernism. We go on and we say that modernism is an aftershock of Victorianism and a prehistory of something else. What we find is that any period is, if you will, stratified by the remainders of past periods and the kind of promises or the prophecies, if you will, of later periods. And that to me is the beauty of a dialectical theory of literary history, a dialectical literary history, because it understands that any particular literary period, any slice through literary time is always going to be contradictory. It's always being crisscrossed by the future and the past at any moment. And that literary history is entirely indebted to the kind of theoretical machinery that Hegel gives us, that Marx gives us, that is given to us by this radical 19th century revision of dialectic, which says contradiction is not a sign of falsity, it is not a sign of a limit, but contradiction is actually a very powerful analytic tool in its own right, and that contradiction is a kind of engine, it's a driver of history, and it's a driving force behind being. Well, I hope that gives you some idea of what dialectic is and what Hegel and Marx did to it in the 19th century, so when it comes up again, you might have some better idea of the philosophical lineage that produces this term. So I'll end it there. One final thing, congratulations to Southampton, back in the Premier League.